My name is Elaine Wilson, and I am today going to begin a series of 3 lectures on Russian history. I am not a political historian, I am an art historian. And eventually, after the 3 lectures on Russia, I will be talking to you about 3 Russian artists, all internationally well known. But they all lived through the years of the USSR. But in order to get to the USSR and an understanding of what that time period was like and now what the Russian Federation is like, we have to start back a few years earlier than that, in fact, a few centuries. Before we begin, I have a couple business items to take care of with you. The first one has to do with this sheet, and some of you have already requested it. On the sheet is a list of some of the rulers that I will be discussing. There are others that I have also included that are not named because I'm not going to spend much time on them. And you will also find that if you look from Ivan the Terrible to Catherine II, Catherine the Great, that's what I'm going to talk about today. And then next week, on Thursday, I will be starting with Alexander, and I will end around the time of Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin. My background on Russia is rather extensive in a personal way. I have written a book about it. I don't write books about everything that I lecture on. However, this book has a lot of information in it about Russia, about the Russian people. Some of the information that I'll be sharing with you in the programs is included in this book, but not all of it. The book is much thicker than just an hour or 2 or 3 program could be. It gives you an insight into how the Russians lived and how they still, in many ways, still feel and have been conditioned to feel about their country. So in order to begin this, and at the end, I'll mention the book again. It's on Amazon.com, and it's all you do is let them know you want one, and the turnaround time is just a couple of days, and you can have the book. In the meantime, let's get started talking about this ancient land called Russia. I will be going from Ivan the Terrible to Vladimir Putin. This is the time frame that I will actually be covering, 1547 to 2020. And I do have some information about him that I will certainly be sharing, but we start at the beginning. And actually, Ivan was crown czar at the age of 16, and he would reign for 37 years. Vladimir was first elected as a president of Russia in 2000, and he was there till 2008. And then his friend Medvedev was elected and was there for 4 years, and now Putin is again in charge of running the country called the Russian Federation. The USSR was established in December of 1922, and it was under the time frame of Vladimir Lenin. This is how the country looked in 1989 under Mikhail Gorbachev. And as you're well aware, it will be Gorbachev who will begin the process of dissolving the gigantic size of this country, because many of the countries that were around them were actually satellites. At this time, in 1989, there were 15 republics in Russia, and it does cover 11 time zones. It still does that. The title that Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky decided they would use for their socialist ideas was Workers of the World Unite. It's an interesting title. Keep that in mind. I probably won't refer to it for a couple of weeks again. But this was, at this point in time, this was the largest country in the world. The Russian Federation today looks like this. It's smaller. The satellite countries around it that had been usurped by the USSR, Romania, Albania, many, many other countries. I'm not going to take time to name all of them. But it has shrunk some in size to more of its original historic land mass. I will be focusing on two cities today. One is St. Petersburg, because that will be the city founded and actually built by Peter the Great. And I will start with Moscow, because that is where we find Ivan the Terrible. And it's many years before there's ever a St. Petersburg built. If there's a question in your mind as to when everything started to fall apart in this country and other countries started to pick up their own reins and move forward, it started around 1985. The war in Afghanistan contributed to it. Another big problem for them was their fall in oil prices. Reagan had put the kibosh to some of their grandiose plans. They were going, and still try, to support themselves with their exportation of fuel. They were to have built 2 pipelines that would come down through in Russia and into Europe, and that would be the way that they would be able to support their economy. But Reagan got in the way of that, and not only was there only 1 pipeline built, but it was 6 years later than what they had anticipated. So that also helped with some of this dissolution that happened. And then also some of the satellite countries, I mentioned several. Another one is Hungary. I mean, some of these other countries, and they had started to just be very tired of somebody in Russia and Moscow telling them what to do, and they were looking for an opening, and it will certainly come. And that, of course, is another topic for us in another day. Today, the political opposition to Putin is very weak. I don't think you question that. And debate in that country is discouraged. As a disclaimer, let me say, I will not be giving you any personal opinions about anything that I discuss in regard to this country. First of all, I have many, many friends that are Russian, and I really do love the country. I find my favorite country, of course, is the United States, but I find Russia to be a very welcoming place for me to go, and it has been since my first trip there in the late 1980s. However, I do know that it is judicious for me to be careful that I do not say anything that is disparaging about either country, because people are always interested in watching what we do and say, and what they watch me do and say should be certainly at some level agreeable for everyone. There are some considerations that I will reflect on with you as we go through to the very end. Russia has an interesting series of reflection to reflect upon that continue through all of their years. Watch these 5 descriptors: expansionism, control, megalomaniac, fear, and strong. Watch those descriptors flow through all of the centuries to today. They are common denominators that the Russian people have learned to accept, that the Russian rulers have exercised, and you'll see as I go along how some of that is expressed. It's always helpful when I start a series like this that everybody gets to the same place and can move from there into what they might or might not already be familiar with. So I'm going to start with the Resurrection Gate, which leads into Red Square. Now, if you notice this gate, it has 2 openings, and between the 2 openings there is a small chapel. Here you see it. It's called the Ivaron Chapel. The chapel is very tiny. People from the time of Ivan the Terrible, it was erected in 1535. People of all types, kings, queens, and beggars, would go in there and bow and cross themselves and ask for prayers of support and care as they moved forward into Red Square, because that again is a very important site. It has been important for centuries, and it is actually not the center of Russia. Back here, when I take out these people that are here, behind these two people there is a circle, and on that circle is the dial that lets you know that that is exactly the center of Moscow. So Red Square is to the side of that. You'll also notice that as you would enter one of these gates, and they are very high because horses went through them, carriages went through them, at the far end is what I call the giant tinker toy of all time, and that is St. Basil's Cathedral. I'll make mention of that again in a few minutes. Faith has always been a very important part to Russian citizens. Even during the times of atheism, the 70 years when they were denied access to their churches and when they could be surprised by people knocking on their door who were in authority to come in to check to see if in the corner of their room they had perhaps a little altar or something set up. The only altars that they were allowed to have during the years of the USSR were ones that honored Lenin. The Russian people have endured a great deal over all of the centuries, and there is a sense of unease that they carry with them all the time. They can never be sure that tomorrow will be better than today. It's inbred in them, and in some ways I find it to be very poignant and very heart-filled. They love their country. Even though they might not appreciate their rulers, they say very little about them. But they do love their country. Russia is important to them. The birch trees, the mushrooms in the forest, the fall. Oh, it's beautiful. I have been there all different times of year, and it's beautiful no matter when you're there. Notice up here, I say it was erected, and then it was destroyed. And then it was reconstructed in 1996. What happened here? Stalin was having then his large parades of war machines and marching soldiers across Red Square. And these two gates were making it very difficult to get everybody in. They had to be funneled through there. So he had this entire thing completely removed. So for many years when I was going there, there was nothing there, and I really wasn't aware that there ever had been. But in 1996, it was reconstructed, and they had kept the original plans, and so they were able to reconstruct it as it had been. It is a place that perhaps every single person of authority that I'm going to speak about in the next 3 weeks will have walked through this area or through those gates. The cobblestones are worn very, very smooth. Ivan the Terrible was terrible. Now we know what we mean when we say terrible. The Russian word is grozny, and that can also mean strong. And so Ivan had no problem with them calling him Ivan the Terrible, because to him it meant that they thought he was a very strong man. He lived for a considerable length of time, and here is the time frame in which he was czar. He was born into the dynasty called the Rurik dynasty, and it will be the last of this dynasty with him and then with his son. And His father died when he was very early, so his mother pretty much had to act as regent until he was 16 or 17 years old. There's a forensic face of Ivan, gives you a better idea of what he looked like. This painting of him, I have stood in front of it. It is huge. He is bigger than life. Out the window, you can see the Russian snow-covered buildings. Down here on the steps, the carpet that goes down carries the Russian two-headed eagle as a design on it. He carries a staff. That staff is a good thing, and it turns out to be a very, very bad thing for him. But he carries that with him as a mark of authority. He wears this kind of fur-covered crown a lot of the time. And in his hand, he was suspicious about evil spirits. He's carrying bells with him. He is the first Tsar. He has himself named Tsar, and it is the Russian word for the Roman Caesar. So this is what he sees himself as being. And this is his lovely wife, Anastasia. He and Anastasia, and notice her last name, Romanova. Romanova will be the family line that will carry through from her, clear through Peter the Great, until we get to Nicholas II in 1918 when he is murdered. But he and Anastasia have 3 daughters and 3 sons. She was wonderful with him. And during the years of their marriage, she just knew exactly how to manage him. And what had happened is he had proclaimed himself Tsar, and 2 weeks later, he had picked her as his bride. The custom then was to have anybody who had a daughter of marrying age from a noble or royal background to parade them in front of Ivan, and he would take his pick. And he had chosen her, and wisely so, because she was gentle, she was kind, and she knew how to keep him under control, which doesn't last after she died. She was killed with mercury poisoning. That was what was popular at that time for getting rid of people. They would sneak it into the food or into the drink, and so she only lives until 1560. Ivan will go on to have more children. More wives. Some of them actually were like children, because by the time he was finished, he was old, and the wives just kept getting younger and younger. He has about 6, and I have wives in parentheses because, or in quotes, because the church after the 3rd one decided they'd had enough of it, and they were not going to honor any more of his wives. So he might have married them or not, but he considered them to be his wives, and this is one of them. This is Vasilisa. Vasilisa was wife number 6. Wife number 7 will live after Ivan the Terrible dies. But I'm just picking out one to show you a couple of things about him and his relationship with these other women, not with Anastasia, but these other women. You see how he's sneaking around behind her? She was lovely. He considered her so beautiful that he would wait till she went to sleep, and then he would come in there and sit. You see his cane in both places? He will use that, and you'll see very soon why. He found out that Vasilisa, as lovely as she was, had attracted another lover, and of course somebody much younger. And so he had the lover brought to where he and Vasilisa were, and he had him impaled, and then he had him taken out and buried alive. And yes, she sat and witnessed all of that. She won't live much longer than that herself. He gets tired of her. He does something to her. The Russian history on all of these people is varied. It's varied as much as the person who wrote it. Some say he drowned her, some say he poisoned her, and others say that he buried her alive. One of the continuing statements that they all make is that of all of his wives, there are 2 that they've never found any graves for, and she happens to be one of them. So where she ended up and how she ended up, I don't know, except that he does go on in a couple of weeks and finds another young bride. St. Basil's Cathedral is built during the time of Ivan the Terrible. Those are the dates when it was built. It was finished 1 year after his beloved Anastasia dies. This church is an entire lecture for an hour at least, and I'm going to encapsulate it with just a couple of points for you. Again, common denominators for all of us to be able to relate to. This is an artist's rendering of what it looked like or could have looked like in Red Square when the cathedral was under construction. And over here on the far side, you can see Ivan the Terrible standing and looking out on the construction. The construction for the cathedral was turned from, it had been wooden, it was made into brick. The brick was made at a monastery called Andronikov. The monks at that monastery made bricks and sold those as a way to support their monastery. You'll notice that the walls of the Kremlin are white. They will eventually supply, the monks will supply the same bricks that were used on St. Basil's Cathedral for the walls of the Kremlin. The Kremlin is surrounded by a moat, and one of the reasons why there was a lot of trouble about Stalin running his, and the others as well, Brezhnev and Khrushchev and all of them, running their armor and their soldiers across Red Square, is under Red Square there's a river. And there's a moat along here. Now the moat has been filled in. It was filled in for one of the later Tsar's weddings, but the walls of the cathedral, or the walls of the Kremlin, are the bricks. They're made from the bricks that were used to build this, and they are not, the bricks that they used, or they are not the standard quote-unquote universal size. They are a different size than what we today consider to be standard. So in some cases, when it's been time to make repairs, it's been a little difficult. Here is the Lady in all of her glory. St. Basil's Cathedral includes 9 chapels, and those 9 chapels represent Ivan the Terrible's conquests. I want to point out quickly to you a couple of them. On the 4 corners that represent north, south, east, and west, there is a large chapel. And in between each one of those, there are 4 what they call floating chapels, and you can see 2 of them here. So they're northeast, they're southwest, they're in between each one of the others. These large ones have foundations. These float on pads. But they are all a part of this large cathedral, which then has this tented center dome. This was never built to be used by citizens. This was Ivan the Terrible's personal place. He kept his war supplies in the basement. I've been there when his trunk has been in there. And he would go in there and pray for all that he does and doesn't do, and all of the horror that he spreads around. He drowns people, he burns them alive, he freezes them to death because he considered himself to be God's earthly representative, and he could do whatever his mind brought to him to do. Ivan will get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and pray for a couple of hours before he will go about his day. So he had a religious side. And St. Basil, who is buried here in this little building, which is attached, was really the only one during the time of Ivan the Terrible, after Anastasia's death, that Ivan would listen to. And St. Basil, that is a whole other story itself. I mean, sometimes to prove his loyalty to God, he walked the streets in blistering cold weather with hardly anything at all on. I mean, he was quite a man, but he died a natural death. Ivan the Terrible did not punish him, but it was an interesting relationship between the two of them. This is a picture that I took last February when I was there. And this is, again, Ivan the Terrible's St. Basil's Cathedral and this tower that he would come out of to go over here so he could do his prayers in the morning. Interestingly enough, St. Basil's Cathedral becomes a symbol of the Cold War. And it just seems like it is the only light that is behind the Iron Curtain. But here we have, it was built by Ivan, and then we come clear into the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and it still remains the symbol of Russia. Ivan's early years were not good. After his father died and his mother was a regent, he was oftentimes under the care of boyars who were jealous, who wanted control. They mistreated him and his brother as children, and he witnessed many murders. And I'm talking not just about somebody stabbing somebody in the heart. I'm talking about having somebody's head cut off, having them drawn and quartered right in front of you in the courtyard. Absolutely horrific things. And this really had a very deep effect on the personality of Ivan. It got to the point where he would kill things too. And so what he did is he would take animals, especially dogs, and he would just throw them over the walls of the Kremlin and then watch them fall to their death. He did have time as a child to become well educated, and he was well read, and he had a photographic memory. So you wanted to remember what you said to him or what you sent to him in a letter, because if he read it once, he would remember it forever. He also was considered by the Russian people at that time to probably have the most energy and probably was the most hardworking person in the country. After the death of Anastasia, as I have mentioned, things started to fall apart. He stopped the serfs from moving around. They would find a place where they could work, and then they'd have family that would move someplace else, and they would move there, and they would work on that estate. Oh no, that stopped. No mobility for the serfs. Where they were was where they stayed. They became the possession of the person who owned the estate. He also established the first secret police. He called it Oprichniny. And these photographs or these paintings give you an example of what these men were like. There was a whole army of them, all dressed in black, all riding on black horses, all carrying the emblem of a dog. There's one there, and there's one over here. A dog attached to their saddle because they were considered to be vicious, and wherever they came, they swept clean, and so the symbol of the broom is also there. You'll notice that the two men carry whips in their hands. This man's is over here, and they were brutal. The best thing that could happen is if you saw them coming across the plains towards your small area was to run and hide as best you could, because usually they destroyed everything that was in their path. They were very vicious. Ivan the Terrible killed his son. Ivan the Terrible and Anastasia had 3 children. Dmitri, the oldest one, who would have inherited the throne, he was with his father and mother, and they were going to transfer from one boat to another to pay homage to God and thankfulness for their life and their blessings. And the maid carrying, the nurse carrying Dmitri, dropped the child into the water, and Dmitri drowned. So the next child was Ivan. Ivan, and here's a close-up picture of this, and Ilya Ripin is one of the artists who is very popular, a Russian artist who's very popular, and I will show you as I go along some other paintings that he has done as well. There's no time to discuss his life with you right now, but he is very famous for recording Russian history. Ancient history, he was not there when this happened, but ancient history as well as history during the times of Lenin. Ivan hid his son because what had happened is this man, Ivan, the son, had married twice before. He had married 2 other women that then his father decided were not going to produce an heir. So he had both of them sent to nunneries. Now he gives Ivan another wife. This wife does get pregnant, but this wife evidently, Ivan the Terrible, caught her in her apartment or someplace and wearing something that he did not consider to be modest enough, and he kicked her in the stomach, and he really hurt her. And the child miscarried. And the child was a boy, and he would have been heir to the throne after his father would have died. Well, his father never gets to the throne because Ivan uses that cane I've mentioned to you. And in the heat of the battle between the two of them, this man is trying to defend his wife and also criticize his father for what has happened. Ivan took this and hit him in the side of the head. And the damage was such that his son will only live for a couple of days. The socialists loved this picture. This picture hangs in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow, and it was a picture that they really enjoyed looking at because it showed them how socialism brings happiness and suffering had brought such tragedy during the rule of the czars. This is Ivan the Terrible sitting beside the bed of his son Ivan, who is dying. You'll notice Ivan the Terrible's beads are on the floor, and there, of course, is his son laid out with his head bandaged. And this man, of course, is performing the last rites, and others have lined up to come in and bless his soul. Ivan has one son left, and his name is Fedor. And Fedor will be the last of this dynasty, and Fedor is weak-minded, really not capable of being a czar, certainly not capable of running a country, but he will take over the reins when Ivan dies. Here's what happened to Ivan. As he aged, he got more unhinged than he'd been before, and his police, his secret police became more out of hand and more willing to just go out across the plains and plunder and kill whatever they could find. There will be famines, there will be depopulations, people are trying to move, and there will be 20 years when there are wars during the last years of Ivan the Terrible's life, and all of this weakens the country. Novgorod is a good example. It's north of Moscow, and Novgorod had people that were merchants, and the merchants were doing their best to make good livings for themselves and their family and support their city, and Ivan suspected that they were against him. So he sent his police, and they murdered all of them, got rid of them. Now, Ivan decides towards the end of his life, he finds out from somebody who read his hand or whatever, that he was going to die before too long and that he should make amends. So here he is on his knees. His cap is now, the crown is on the ground, showing that he has humbled himself. And he is asking for the order of the cloth so he can save himself into eternity. The woman that read his hand said that he would die suddenly, and that before he died he would see a sign in the sky, that it would be different from a usual evening. One night Ivan is on his way across an open second-level corridor to get to another part of the palace where his friend is waiting for them to play chess. And he looks up in the sky, and there is an apparition that is unusual. And Ivan is a little concerned about that, but he goes ahead on thinking that maybe it was just really an accident that he saw that, but while he's playing chess, he dies. He either was killed with mercury poisoning, or most people think that he died of a heart attack while he was playing chess. What happens next? First of all, look at this. He was the first czar. He centralized the government. His word could not be questioned. He was a megalomaniac. He moved to expand Russia's borders. I cannot cover all of the geographical or historical history of each one of these people as I go along. So I'm just picking out interesting points for all of you and hope that you'll do some of your own research if something especially interests you. But they became a very strong nation. He had his police, which operated and strengthened control over the people. And of course, it restricted the people and they were afraid. Following his death will become Fedor will become Tsar, and this is where, if you're familiar with Boris Godunov or the opera about that, Boris Godunov comes in and he does a pretty good job of advising Fedor. But then Fedor dies and Godunov takes over, and he is really only there until 1605. There are some serious problems. There was a volcano that erupted in Peru, and the volcano sent ash and blinded out the sun for weeks at a time, and the crops suffered in Russia. There was also what they call now the Little Ice Age. From 1601 to 1603, about a third of the people died. What happened was in the summer, in July, the temperature could go down well below freezing. And all of this is happening while Godunov is still there. Others will follow, Dmitri, and then we come to Mikhail Romanov. There's that name, you want to remember that. And there are some others as well. And now we come to Peter the Great. Mikhail's grandson was Peter the Great, and this will become again the official Romanov dynasty. Peter the Great is a very innovative man, probably considered to be the most innovative in Russian history. When I get to the third series in this, I'll show you the large 90-foot sculpture that now sits in the river in Moscow to remind the Russian people of the prominence of Peter the Great. He has become very, very popular over there today. Peter the Great suffered some of the same issues as a child and experiences as a child as Ivan the Terrible. He watched his two uncles dragged out of the palace, drawn and quartered in the courtyard, and then hung up in pieces. He watched unbelievably tragic things happen to other people, and those memories haunt him all of his life. He always had kind of a twitch. He didn't carry his head straight up. He carried it on an angle, and they think some of that might have been as a result of his childhood shocks. Or later in life, he will also suffer from some convulsions. He is forced to marry a woman named Eudoxia. His mother decides that Eudoxia, who's 6 years older than he is, would make a perfect wife for him. He doesn't think so, but he has no choice. He's 16, Eudoxia is 21, and they get married. It is definitely not a marriage made in heaven, as you're going to see. But Peter will, in spite of his bad marriage, he will go on and keep working to westernize Russia, to take it out of the medieval period and into the period of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in Europe, to more contemporary times. You'll notice he doesn't have a beard. When he became a czar, men all wore beards. He went to Europe, found out that the men were not wearing beards, came home and called a whole lot of them that were of authority into Red Square, into the center of the square, and shaved off their beards. And they were to shave off the beards of anybody that they had authority over. People were arrested if they were seen with beards. He did a lot of things with changing the clothing that the people wore at that time. Was interested in a total westernization of Russia. He will eventually marry a woman named Catherine. This is not Catherine the Great, but this will be Catherine the First. Here is Peter's Feast de la Résistance. Here it is. St. Petersburg. He built that over a period of 20 years, and it cost so many lives. There were mosquitoes, there were blizzards, there was rain, there was snow. You can see here Peter standing, looking out across there, and people back in Moscow saying, my goodness, all that land is good for is growing cabbages and turnips, and he's out there trying to build a city on the water. Well, he does. And to show you how hard the wind is blowing, here are two of his associates, are back here, bracing themselves against the force of the wind. If you've been to St. Petersburg, you know that it's one of those cities where you do wear 6 layers of clothing every day, because the weather can change from being very cold and difficult to by mid-afternoon being sunny and quite warm. So it's an interesting geographical site, but it was his opportunity to get a city for Russia to have on the water, and it will become his opening into Europe, into transportation, bringing things from other countries to his country. Here is his half-sister. His half-sister's name is Sophia, and she is the sister of Ivan V. His name was on that list I skipped over a little bit ago in a previous slide. When Mikhail dies, Ivan V is to become the Tsar. Peter is the first wife, or Peter is the half-brother of Ivan. This is Eudoxia, this is Peter's first wife. Peter and Ivan will rule in conjunction with their older half-sister, Sophia. And Sophia gets herself into a lot of trouble over that before it's over, because when Peter is about 16, he decides to make himself the Tsar, and he does that. And before it's all over, he wants to get rid of her, so he puts her in a nunnery, and he will find that she has been trying to usurp his authority, so he puts her in a nunnery. And Eudoxia's family is causing him some trouble, so what does he do? Why, they owned Siberia at that time, was part of Russia. So he just banished all of them to Siberia. Now, the good news about Eudoxia is that she will outlive Peter. In fact, she will outlive their son. And she actually does come out of the nunnery later in her late years, because she never took the veil. Now, Sophia is not quite so lucky. After her first attempt, and Peter threatened her, then she decides again that she is going to take over Russia. He is out of the country. He finds out about this, and as quick as possible gets back, and sure enough, she is trying to usurp his power to take over the throne, and this is the second time. Now I have an arrow coming down here. Notice that in this window there is a noose and there is a body hanging there. He didn't kill Sophia, but what he did do is that he had all of the men that were working with her to try to take over the reins. He had all of them brought to Red Square, and it was a very, very large bloodbath, of which he participated in as much as his other loyal soldiers. So many of the men were killed then. There's a monastery not too far from the center of Moscow. At that time it was further, but now with the roads it's not. Novodevichi Monastery, where he sent Sophia. Now Sophia will have her own apartment, but her punishment will be that outside the window of her apartment, men that she knew and cared for a great deal will be hanged to death. And they will be hanged to death and hang there until it's not possible to leave them hang anymore, and then they'll be replaced with another one. And yes, if you think something can drive you mad, that probably would be one of the things that could do it, and it did. She will die in the monastery. Now you'll also notice that he doesn't trust her anymore. So back here, there's a figure of a person sitting, watching her. So she was watched all the time by people who were alive, And she could not look out a window without seeing somebody she knew hanging in that window. Peter the Great's Russia looked like this. Peter the Great's Russia was rather extensive. They continued to expand their geographical footprint. Peter the Great becomes known as a shipbuilder. There are many, many, many different trades. I have Master of 7 trades. Some books will tell you there were 12. He founded the Russian Navy. He was strong, he was powerful, he was huge. He was 6'8", that's in the next line here. He had a curious body. He had a small head, small hands, and small feet, but he could outwork anybody, and he could be a very, very, very bold person. He solved problems. That's one of the things he liked to do. But if the problem called for some kind of revenge, he could be very, very vicious. Like Ivan the Terrible, he was also very religious. This is the sculpture I mentioned before, and I'll mention it again later. But this, in 1996, this was installed. It's 90 feet high in the Moscow River beside the Kremlin Wall. And it's to remind the people of Moscow that Peter the Great was one of their great founders and leaders, and they should respect him. So this is their tribute. Now, do the Moscow people like this? I would like to say I haven't found anybody who does. There must be somebody out there, but I don't know who that person is. At this point, they just consider it kind of a nuisance, but it's there and it will be staying there. Peter and Eudoxia have only one child, and his name is Alexei, and you can see him here. Alexei was indifferent to Peter, to his father. He was lazy. He tried to plot against his father. He was quite a problem child, and he will grow up to be married, and they will have a son named Peter, who will be Peter II, but he is never a czar. Here's what happens. See the papers on the table? Those papers are papers that have been presented to Peter the Great to sign to release Alexei from a term in prison, which he has decided Alexei deserves to experience. Alexei is imprisoned in the St. Petersburg. There's a prison on the at the Peter and Paul Fortress. I have visited that prison. That is definitely not a place you want to go to. In the United States, we had some prisoners one time that were striking because they didn't think the toilet paper was soft enough. In this country, there was no such thing as a strike, and you would be lucky that the floor of your prison cell was not dirt, and that on the floor you at least had some kind of cushion to rest your head on. The prison cells were just horrific places, and Alexei will not live to come out of those. He is murdered. So there's Alexei's mother, Eudoxia, and it's the wife that Peter was forced to marry. And in the meantime, he's on a campaign one time, and he comes across a German maid named Martha. And Martha will be crowned empress by Peter the Great in 1724. They will eventually be married. They will have had 9 children, a couple of them before they are married. But they will have 9 children. And she will rule Russia because she's the empress, the Tsarina. She will rule Russia for 2 years after Peter died. She died at 43, and as best I can find, and I have researched this, I am not sure what she died of. I can't tell you, but it seemed that she was in her 40s at the time. She was healthy, seemed to be okay, but somebody didn't want her around. Two of her children are Elizabeth and Anne. Elizabeth and Anne are both born before the church recognizes the marriage of Peter and Martha, who then takes the name of Catherine. And from that marriage, Elizabeth will have no children, but Anne will marry a German, and her son Peter III will marry the future Catherine II. Here's Peter the Great for the last time. Peter the Great had this painting done to send to the British king so that he could see what a fine specimen of a man he was, because he was going to be visiting. So it was a form of a very large ornate calling card, I'd like to think. And here is Peter again with many of the symbols that surrounded his life. There is the Admiralty in St. Petersburg. Under his hand, you can see a map of the world, because he was very much interested in expanding the country of Russia. He was good at war, and he had no problem with causing it. It would bring him what he needed. And he had no problem using a sword if somebody got in his way. It's a very powerful painting that was done of him. This one is rather sad. This is Peter on his deathbed. He will die in 1725 at the age of 52. He had a lot of illnesses. It wasn't just his kidneys. I say suffered in life with kidney issues. It wasn't just that. He had other issues as well. But he was such a powerful man that he would just power through whatever the pain or whatever it was that was causing his trouble and keep going. But in the summer of 1774, the year before he dies, doctors removed 4 pounds of blocked fluid from his kidney area, from his bladder. After this, of course, he does do some recovery, and you'll notice that he dies in February. He dies in February because in January he'd gotten out of bed and he had gone out, insisted on going out and inspecting something, and it was cold and rainy and icy, and it was his desire to do that, but it was then his last trip out. February the 8th, he is dead. And when they did an autopsy on his body, they found that his bladder was completely filled with gangrene. So he had put up with a great deal of pain during his lifetime. He caused a lot of pain during his lifetime, but he certainly moved the country of Russia ahead. He reigned for 42 years. Here's a look at some of the things that are the accomplishments of Peter the Great. He had terrible rage. He saw what he could do to his half-sister Sophia and her followers. And his fear that people were very afraid of irritating him. His deeds are to the point where I just say they were dastardly, and I would certainly not list them for you. You can read them for yourselves. But he was a megalomaniac. And people loved him or hated them, but they all feared him, so they obeyed him. He was profoundly religious, just as Ivan the Terrible had been, and he also felt that he was an instrument of God for good. But that to him meant that he was in charge. He was in control. He carried out the earliest modernization and expansionism efforts, the biggest one that had ever occurred in ancient Russia, and he took the ancient Russia from that into a Russian empire, a major powerhouse. You'll find this last little snippet important. Putin keeps a portrait of Peter the Great in his office. Peter the Great is one of Putin's heroes. Elizabeth will reign for 21 years. She is the oldest daughter of Peter the Great. She's the first Romanov woman. Up until this time, no women rulers in Russia. And there will be few and far between in the years after her. When Peter the Great died, in order to keep her under control, he had a grandson who took over, and then Anna, and then Ivan the Sixth comes along, and Smolny Institute is there in convent, so that's where she hides out, till she finally realizes she could take charge. So she does that, and she organizes things to the point that she becomes very popular with the people. She reigns for a period of time when there are no executions, which must have made everybody happy. And she does leave an heir, who is Peter III. That will be her heir to the throne. She brought what we call enlightenment to this country, but she was quite vain. They were aghast when she finally died, and they went to her quarters and realized that she had 15,000 French gowns. And when she chose the fabric for her gowns, the textile people had to come to her first. Anything she picked could not be used by anybody else. If she found somebody who wore a piece of jewelry that was like hers, if she found anybody with a costume on that included any of the fabric in her own gown, the person was banished. She hosted large balls, 2 a week. When she hosted a ball, she had one that was for about 800 people, and that was a normal ball. And then she had another ball where she would bring in about 100, 200 of her best friends, but they all had to cross-dress. And the reason they had to do that is because Elizabeth considered her legs to be absolutely gorgeous, and she liked to wear the white stockings that were popular on men at that time. And if she went as a man, she could show off her wonderful legs. So that's why they had the 2 balls a week. She modernized roads because she was trying to bring culture into Russia, and she built many, many significant structures, or at least got them started. And she continued work on the royal palace. At the end of her life, she suffers some serious dizzy spells. I think a lot of these people had what my father would probably have called hardening of the arteries. And it would have certainly have been reflected in a cause of, probably caused by some of the food or the diet that they had. She wouldn't take any medicine at all. She said she was stronger than that. And so she does die of a stroke. What's next? Well, first of all, this is where everybody's been living. This is sometimes called the Winter Palace. It's also the Hermitage. And it was worked on for over 100 years. And it was the home of the Tsars until the time when Nicholas II and his family are removed from there, and then of course the following year they are killed. This is an aerial view of this. It was small when it started, and then wings were added to it. The Neva River is out here. This is the courtyard in front of, in case you have been there to St. Petersburg. Now we have Peter III, who has been designated as the new Tsar, and he has a bride whose name will become Catherine II. Peter was born in Germany. His mother was Anna, another one of Peter the Great's children. And Anna will only live a short time after her son is born. So Peter barely speaks any Russian. And he is a rather odd person. In fact, Catherine said that when she first met him, she thought that he was 10 years old at the time, and she thought that he was just rather odd, or that he was drunk, because he seemed, even at that age, to like to drink. So when they were together, if they were together apart in the same palace, but he would stay at one end and she would stay at the other. He's only emperor for 6 months, so it's hardly worth mentioning, except I need to use him as the bridge to get to Catherine II, because Catherine II is German. She is not Russian, and he will abdicate the throne to her. By that time, he has gone to one of his favorite palaces outside of St. Petersburg, and he realizes that things are not going to go well for him. I'll show you a couple of things that he does accomplish in his short time as a Tsar, but he had terrible fits of rage, and he either allowed one of those to kill him, or somebody in the process of having a confrontation with him killed him. There was never any research done on that. He will become the father of Tsar Peter IV. They will have 2 children. The daughter Anna will die as an infant. He permitted religious freedom, which was something wonderful, but he also said to the nobles, if your serfs are doing things you don't like, just send them to Siberia, it's okay. And he abolished the security police. So that allowed a lot more activity than that was either good or bad to occur. He loved all things Prussian. He used to walk around playing a Prussian soldier. He had Prussian uniforms that he wore. He had little tin soldiers that he set up, and he played with those. Well, you can imagine. Catherine must have thought that was a bit odd for a person his age and in his position. And yes, she had been right. He was a perpetual drunk. He did have a violent temper. And what was interesting is that she found him not only difficult personality-wise, but to look at. His face had gotten very badly scarred from smallpox, and his hair had fallen out and hardly grown in. So you can see the thinness of his hair up there. He amused himself by degrading people. This is another thing that kept her some distance from him. He'd take a nobleman that was of importance, and he would have them dress up, the nobleman, dress up in a costume covered with feathers and bring him into the throne room, and he would have a large basket there filled with eggs, and he would have the nobleman ordered to sit on the basket of eggs and cluck like a chicken. Now, that's a rather degrading thing to do to a person, any person, but he could be very brutal. So his death was shortly after he abdicated the throne to Catherine, and he wasn't missed at that point by many people. Okay, here's Catherine the Great. Catherine grew up as Sophia, this minor German princess, and she will marry Peter the Great's daughter, Anne's son, Peter the Third, who speaks more German than Russian and likes Prussia better than Russia. But at 33, she ascends to the throne, and she doesn't always stay this svelte. You'll see her get a little larger in the next frame. However, she is intent on bringing glory and power to Russia. She has seen what Peter the Great has done. She wants to hold on to that. She wants to expand on that, and she will. She will increase the size of the country. And she ruled for an extensive period of time. She is the longest ruling female in Russian history, and they call her time frame the Golden Age of Russia. Here she is, a little larger. This is more the size that she became. She had been engaged to a man in Germany, and that Peter had picked out for her. And the man had died 2 weeks before the wedding, and so she never married. But she would rule, and she would have many lovers. At least we've been able to count 21. Now, we're not talking one-night stands. These were men that she spent time with over a period of a couple of years. And she will start to amass a personal collection of art. And the Hermitage today includes many, many, many paintings that she selected as part of her collection. She was an extremely intelligent person, and like her predecessor, Peter the Great, she had a natural ability to govern. She could be very, very, very determined, but she had more energy than anybody else in the room. She absolutely, I say admired, she adored Peter the Great, and she fashioned her life after his as much as she could in many ways. She will continue to modernize Russia. And she takes the Smolny Institute, where Elizabeth has been for a while until things calm down, and she turns it into an institute to educate young women. And this will be the first time that women are allowed to legally get an education in Russia. It's an important point. She was extremely egotistical, and like her predecessors, she could be very, very, very ruthless. But she does expand borders, and she is the one, in case you're wondering where Alaska fits into all of this, she is the one, they own Alaska, and she is the one who forces people to go there to live, to colonize it. She also has a very distinct distaste for the Jewish people. During her reign, they have usurped a lot of the land that was Poland before Poland disappeared and was no more Germany, and Russia kept chewing pieces of it apart. And the parts that she got had a lot of Jews in it, and the Jewish people were merchants and bankers and enthusiastic, and she decided she couldn't have that. And so she took a large portion of Belarus and divided it off and said, this is where all Jews have to live, and to leave this site, you must have official privilege or permission from the Russian government. Otherwise, this is where you live. One of the artists that I'll present to you grew up in the settlement of the Pale. She started the Bolshoi Theater. It was in a private home in 1776. And if you've been to the Bolshoi Theater, and I've sat here, I've sat down here, I've walked through these gates, it is a fantastic site. The site that it's on right now, it's certainly no longer in a private home. It has been used since 1821. They now have a new Bolshoi right beside it, which is also extremely beautiful, and I have been to programs there as well. Both of those facilities are outstanding. This one is used more for concerts or for practice and things now, and the other one focuses more on the active schedule for the productions. The Bolshoi Theater becomes, for all of the world, the premier site to see ballet dancing. If you get there and the tickets are pie in the sky, don't be surprised. It's the finest ballet you can possibly see. Take it from me. Catherine the Great is the one that the rumors were started by her maidens that she died because she was trying to have sex with a horse and the horse fell out of the harness on top of her. That is really fake news. That is not true. That is not what happened to this woman. She got up early one morning, which was her custom. She had her coffee. It was November the 16th. At 9 o'clock, her lady's maid came in to check on her and found her laying unconscious on the floor. And her face had turned purple, and they rushed her to the bed, and it will be within hours the next day that she dies at the age of 69. I have one more picture I have to show you of her. This is the one she detested the most. This was done 2 years before she died. And I always thought it was a rather attractive, elegant picture. But she said that she just looks sort of frumpy in that picture. Of course, it doesn't have all the glitter and the gold and the jewelry that the other ones that she preferred had. But I think it's a rather interesting, attractive piece or attractive painting done by her. The last thing in this series is this one today, the Bronze Horseman. She ordered this made. She was not Russian, she was German, but she wanted to connect in all of history. She wanted to connect to Peter the Great. This Bronze Horseman will be the symbol of the Russian Empire. If you notice down here, we've got some construction going on. This is during the time of World War II when the Germans were right outside the city of Leningrad, and they had laid siege to it for over 3 years. And you can see how close this statue is to St. Isaac's Cathedral. And some of the shells from the guns damaged some of the marble posts that are on the portico here of St. Isaac's Cathedral. So they felt they had to protect this. They didn't have to protect the stone, but they had to protect the sculpture. The stone is another story. It took 400 men, 24 months to move that stone. They only could see the top of it in Finland, And so then they started digging down, and my goodness, look at the size of this stone. And it has been chiseled away, so it actually was larger than this. When they finally were able to get this to the Bay of Finland to bring it over to St. Petersburg, they could get it on a raft, but the raft had to be supported on either side by 2 large battleships. And that's how it was moved from Finland to St. Petersburg and then installed here. And they say as long as the bronze horseman is there, Russia is alive. The bronze horseman's feet, the feet of the horse, are trampling out violence and vengefulness and killing off anybody that can create trouble for Russia. You can see it here. The face of the bronze horseman is actually a death mask done of Peter the Great. So it's quite important piece for that reason as well. But there's the snake, and over here you can see the writing: Peter the Great, or Peter the First, and Catherine the Second. So there would be no question. Catherine the Great. Look at this. Expansionism. She opened up the Black Sea, defeated the Turks and the Ottomans. They've been fighting Russia's had trouble with a number of countries, same countries, over the years. The Baltic states have been some, Sweden was some for a while, Germany, Turkey. Of course, they destroyed Poland, and then it put itself back together again. But she was very interested in expansionism, and remember, she sets up the settlement of the Pale, which certainly did instill a lot of fear in the Polish people who now belong to the country of Russia, who would not accept them. That whole story, I'll get to that when I get to the artist that grew up there. She had very strong convictions about her rules, and they were not to be questioned. She was a megalomaniac in many ways, and she limited the power of the nobles. They've been able to come and go as they pleased, and she put them into groups, and they could have one spokesman, and that spokesman could come to speak to her, and the rest of them would have to just wait till he got back with the news. She is the first one that put paper money out in circulation in Russia. And she made Russia very, very distinctly a very dominant power in southeastern Europe, which was part of her control. She introduced a lot of educational reforms, such as the school for the women. And she was very interested in culture, the Bolshoi and the arts, and wrote to Voltaire as though he was a pen pal. Just a very, very fascinating woman, but power to be dealt with. Okay, if you have questions or comments for me, please don't hesitate to be in touch with willowvalley.org, or during the week you can be in touch with me if you like. Next Thursday is the day that I'll be giving the lecture, not today, not on Tuesday, because you have a health program coming on Thursday that I hope all of you will enjoy, or on Tuesday. But on Thursday, I will be here at 10:30 to give a lecture, and then the following Tuesday, we will be back on schedule. Some of the men that I will be covering at that time include the last of the Romanovs, and then the Troika, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. If you have questions or you want handouts, again, the address is at askthepresenter@willowvalley.org. Keep in mind, too, that this book may be more help to you than you realize, because it gives you background, personal background, on the lives of the people who lived during the years of the USSR, their ancestors and them. And I was there during the time of Gorbachev and of Yeltsin and certainly Putin and Medvedev. But the book has a lot of interesting information about it that I can't possibly present in the short time. And it also covers some of the history that I have covered with you today, but certainly more information than that. I wouldn't want to give you a book that you already knew everything that was in it. So consider the book. Consider coming back next Thursday. Consider being with me then. And in the meantime, consider making your life as good as you possibly can. Stay healthy, stay safe, and God bless. Thank you.